Thank you very much, Tim. May I do a self-advertising? One of our books published by Ivy Taurus is on the table out there. On kingship and architecture. I work really on architecture and visuality in the larger Persianate world, if you will, but also generally all of us in the history of the arts are concerned with issues of legitimacy, of licit, illicit images, and the particularity of the subject that has been now foregrounded by the actions since quite a while, actually. We should think about this more outside of the immediate past of the Daesh involvement and think a bit more long-term, perhaps, with regards to these material. I want to start by first saying my thanks to Dr. John Curtis, to Astrid Johansson, who must have done enormous work behind the scenes, and to Dr. Bijan Rohani for organizing this conference. It feels like a self-flagellation, depressing kind of a thing, but an important day to gather and think about issues. I have been tasked with to think about the ideology, if you will, behind what Daesh, ISIS, Al-Qaeda promote, adhere to, and act upon. I wanted to start by saying something and acknowledging that there simply can be no comparison between the destruction of monuments, regardless of how important they are to us, and their attendant trauma that is experienced by human beings who live through such violent environments as wars and willful and hostile acts of destruction that are aimed at life. That I know we all share, of course, but it's important to keep in mind that this very concern for human life was held up, perversely, one might add, by the Taliban when they destroyed the great Buddha statues of Bamiyan in March of 2001, which set up the invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan and this kind of a domino effect that we are still living in it. In other words, their argument was that the wealthy and materialistic West, as they claimed it to be to their followers, had prioritized stone sculpture as culture above the well-being of the poor people they claimed to protect and represent. And this had been invariably presented, portrayed in the media, and even in a more erudite environments as this Bamiyan tragedy as an expression of the Islamic iconoclasm or its tendencies towards violent reaction when it concerns images. And we have collectively, and I'm talking about non-specialists who make up the majority of the consumers of this sort of information, be it videos and images or horrifying stories in various journals and so forth, that we have all fallen back onto a misperception and a misrepresentation of Islam and its supposed prohibition on the making of figural images. And this has applied to, for instance, banning of dolls and, did I pronounce it right, and teddy bears to statues and paintings in general. So the question is not iconoclasm, and I want to speak about it a little bit further, but it is about image anxiety, or not iconophobia, a fear of images, or breaking of images, but about anxiety about images. The events that followed the publication of the Danish cartoons of the Prophet were again relegated, now even more forcefully, to that category of Islamic intolerance towards images, extended much more specifically to the portrayal of the Prophet Muhammad himself. And of course, Charlie Hebdo events massacre in Paris of last January seems to almost predictably follow on that same path as we have set ourselves. And indeed, one almost expects this to be a horrific routine to be encountered again and again. Equally disturbing is the fact that the general assumptions about the licit or illicit nature of images and image making in Islam remain woefully underappreciated and little known among general populations. And this, unfortunately, includes Muslims. This is the real tragedy as well. And it's not uncommon to think that, for instance, the cartoon whereby Freddie who has done a drawing of the Prophet is now going to be killed for that. That sort of joke about it is in fact very much telling of a general assumption and a belief among the population at large. Chilling as it may be, we can be sure that the problem remains unresolved with the perception of the acts of destruction and violence that have been directed specifically towards those who we saw through all these presentations this morning, who are accused of perpetrating heresy against Islam, be they people of the book or otherwise, various sects of Islam. It's indiscriminately, actually, as we have seen, takes everybody into its fold, and they contribute or continue to attribute these acts to a universal and unchanging Muslim attitude towards images and image making. So what is the evidence, actually? This is what I would like to share, is what is the evidence or justification for the violence we see against monuments and images that are inflicted by Daesh, by Al-Qaeda, their affiliates and sympathizers, whether they know it or not? How is it that this is so deeply embedded in general understanding? We all know that the sort of puritanical extremist representations of Islam represented or exemplified by what is pejoratively considered as Wahhabism and more perhaps gentler way of saying it is Salafism, neither of which make any of our hearts warm to the actions. Nonetheless, it's important to think about not only is it an extremist point of view, but also in general, even those who are not extremists may not in fact be alert to the religious and textual injunctions or lack thereof. So the textual injunctions, we have seen some of these images before, but I wanted to also recently, I imagine many are also alert to the fact that the World Court just recently took one of the men who destroyed these shrines in Timbuktu to judgment as an act against humanity. So the destruction of the monuments for the first time were considered as an act of genocidal effect on monuments, and this man was actually brought to court. This is very recent, and what it means, what kinds of implications it has, remains to be seen. But people have talked before me about the destruction of Shiite monuments in Syria and Iraq, the destruction of churches, obviously, and of Sufi shrines, which the shrines in general have been targeted across the entire landscape where the Al-Qaeda or Daesh has its hands. So what is known is that the injunctions that even in some of these videos produced by the Daesh representatives who, before destruction of monuments, as Dr. Curtis noted this morning, would recite a passage of the Quran and then proceed to break things down. These are not actually Quranic injunctions, but they have been developed over time and at different rates of intensity, depending on Puritanism or greater variations, if you will, on religious posture and interpretations of traditions, the hadith, those words and deeds that are attributed to the Prophet Muhammad as being models or sort of directives, if you will, to be taken into consideration. These mean that, in fact, there is a wide range of thinking about images. From, for instance, there was a mention about early period of the Iranian Revolution where Ayatollah Khalkhali took the bulldozers to Persepolis and was stopped. At that same time, there were attempts at destroying the wall paintings inside the audience hall of the Chehel Sutun Palace in Esfahan, dating to mid-17th century and afterwards. And thankfully, the members of the Cultural Heritage Organization, local members of the Cultural Heritage Organization, managed to stop them and cover the paintings with wood panels for some time until threat was lifted and the atmosphere was opened up, and there was a greater possibility of actually remaining or keeping them remaining on the walls. And I'm amused by the fact that a young mullah, most likely from Qom, on a tour of Esfahan, is in fact enjoying, together with his wife, looking at these paintings, many of which you cannot see here, are about feasts during which the Shah is hosting some other rulers, and they are all drinking wine. There are dancing girls and musicians, and totally unlike what you would think is permissible in the context of the Islamic Republic of Iran. And this one on the lower right-hand side, which I lifted out of some website, I'm sure it can be found again, which was taken in Peshawar on the street, a sidewalk, where a little child has laid out all these pictures. This is obviously removal of bin Laden, but you can see bin Laden picture together with, I think this is one of those footballers or cricket heroes of Pakistan, and this one, which is really amusing to me, which is an Orientalist painting of the French variety, actually, with one of these very sort of sexualized images of the Oriental woman of the harem. So there is a range of possibilities that allow us to think about images and permissibility of the images. One thing we know is that the Quran is never illustrated, and this is for a variety of reasons, one of which is the fact that God, from a Muslim point of view, cannot be conceived in form. So God is beyond form, therefore one does not represent God in any form that is tangible to the human existence. This goes back to the transcendence, this notion of transcendence. There is, of course, the descriptive aspects and the art of the word that develops in Islam to deal with this particular issue of how to praise the Creator, to engage with the Creator. But it also relates to the fact that in the Quran and the Quranic context, the history of Islam or its tenets, its religious teachings, are not illustrated. So it actually bears some fruit to say there is no such a thing as Islamic art, the way we know of Christian art or Buddhist art, because the religion does not have a repertoire of images that is used for the teaching of the faith. But having said that there are no narrative figural subjects that appear in religious context, That is, no mosque paintings, no madrasa paintings, no shrine paintings. In fact, anything holy, venerable, any sites is free of representations of figural living beings. There's kind of an absence between the Quranic prohibition and then proliferation, actually, of images is a very perhaps paradoxical aspect of what we see in the context of the Islamicate world. Before I go forward, I just wanted to note that where there is indeed a non-religious context, as in a book of history, this is a compendium of history from which a detail is shown here, the life of the prophet can be depicted, that is, starting with his birth and carries on through various aspects. Other prophets are included in there. And the prophet can be seen seated as if he is one of those princes of the Persian house of rule, if you will. But when it is in the context of a religious environment, like the Great Mosque of Damascus, very unusually, actually, we do have representations in mosaics of these idealized villages and sort of paradisiacal garden settings and so forth. Those too disappear from the mosque. But this is very early Islamic, kind of a not being so sure about how to treat this aspect, but always absolutely certain that a religious context does not bear figural representations within its decorative scheme. So all these buildings and villages and scenes of gardens and so forth are free of any image of birds, animals, or humans in the Great Mosque of Damascus. So we are really talking about well-defined sites, contexts, from a Muslim point of view. And indeed, what seems to be an injunction, if you will, in the Quran relates to a particular chapter and verse that deals with an ansab, or statues, which is more broadly understood to be in relation to the idol statues of the pagans of Arabia, where the context allows for an understanding of what is intended here, where the point is about prohibition on consumption also of alcohol and games of chance. So it's all put together as one sort of category of things that Muslims, believers, aren't supposed to do, including worshipping statues. In other words, idolatry is the point here. There are, at the same time, other sources in Islam that show us something of the paradoxical nature of such encounter with images. For instance, there is a series of deeds and words attributed to the Prophet known as traditions or the Hadith, in which one famous al-Bukhari, this is a 9th century scholar, claims that on the day of judgment, artists will be called to bring their images to life, and therefore they will be doomed to fail and sent to hell. This has to do with the fact that this notion of creation being that of the divine is non-negotiable as far as the Quran is concerned. So God is understood to be the creator or maker of the universe, of everything. He is al-Musawwir. It's this ability to form living beings, which is really the issue. And the same root in Arabic, sawar or musawwar, are terms, or taswir, are terms that relate to artists and images, actually. So artists, image making, creation, as long as there is no claim to it coming to life at some point, is indeed, at least the evidence shows us, is actually possible. It's, in many instances, in many cultures, it has been favorably negotiated, if you will. There are the other hadith, and these are entirely related to later interpretations of the ulama, the learned in religious laws and Islamic traditions, where, for instance, contradictory stories might be attributed even to the Prophet, where a hadith tells us that the Prophet protected the images of the Virgin Mary and child and Abraham in Kaaba, while hundreds of idols of the pagans were being smashed to bits in Kaaba. So there is this story of he put his hand on such an image or such a statue, and everything else was okay to destroy, but not this. There is a story about the Prophet's dream that had seen the visage of his future wife, Aisha. So there is something about having imagined the image of a woman who is going to be his wife, his future wife. And there is a very famous story about Aisha's cushion, where Muhammad's wife fashioned curtains out of textiles with figural images, which probably were Sasanian textiles. And the Prophet objected to that because what he was seeing of the images would distract him in the process of prayer and contemplation and dialogue with the divine, whereas a day later, when she turned them into cushions and they were on the ground, you could sit on them, it was okay. In other words, these issues of and stories allow us to see that there are multiple possibilities, there is room for negotiation, and it's not at all a directive that is written in the Quran, and it is entirely non-negotiable. So this is about really idol anxiety rather than about iconoclasm and iconophobia. It's more about the different interpretations of images than about breaking or fearing images across the entire zone of operation of Muslims historically. So indeed, historical texts such as Qisas al-Anbiya or al-Biruni's Al-Athar al-Baqiyya are illustrated with the Prophet's images. At the earlier period, we see the face of the Prophet and his companions. In that case, he confers on Ali. He grants him the investiture as his successor. But at about 16th century, we find that such images begin to appear with the face of the Prophet veiled. But this is also not completely standard. For instance, there are images of the Prophet similar to that investiture one, which date to middle of the 17th century, Iran, for instance, where the Prophet and his companions are in full face, full view of the viewer, actually. This tells us something about the context, actually. There has been a great deal of conversation about Sunni-Shiite divide in this context, as if this is the work of the heretical Shiites and not the Sunnis. Sunnis, contemporary with the Safavid Shiites, like the Ottomans and the Mughals, were also engaged in all kinds of image production, always away from the religious context, but there to be really enjoyed, to be carrying meanings of all kinds, which are largely a matter of a political and social representations of the status of the ruler or the status of, for instance, Barbarossa, the general who led the maritime efforts of the Ottomans. Theological conflicts, in other words, were always present with or in relationship to the ruling body, but it doesn't necessarily mean, in other words, there were objections to image making all along. We know, for instance, from the 8th to 10th century, in the early Umayyad and Abbasid caliphal zones, there were indeed opposition ulama who particularly targeted the proliferation of the luxuries of imperial life, where palaces and bathhouses were decorated with pretty racy, sometimes, images and statues. But that notion, in other words, that notion of a return or a call to return to a supposed purity of early decades, if you will, of Islam, seem to have always been around, and indeed have hardly anything to do with aspects of Sunni or Shiite. In fact, these conditions create certain historical responses which are developed across ages with regards to image making, in which mixture of cultural and political tensions may manifest themselves in varied ways, in varied forms and practices. So you see them in different periods and different places in the Islamic world behaving differently. So, for instance, to celebrate the artist making art, a figural representation, is a perfectly legitimate aspect of the experience of the visual, or in fact, making portraits that are cheap enough to be owned by various people. This we know from both the Ottoman, Safavid, and Mughal contexts as well. So if we were to look at the most immediate context of the particular engagement or the arguments that the Daesh brings to the fore, indeed, this is about that return to the pure beginnings. And it is largely, I think at least, is related to the politics of images rather than to a religious or a spiritual injunction, that it may be positioned at times in those terms and may be looked at as or given as argument for the consumption of the ordinary people. But it is hardly about a spiritual fixity than about a context that is entirely politicized, just as the destruction of the Bamiyan has shown itself to have been about the politics of the time, actually, and the Taliban very cleverly articulated and manipulated the situation. So unless we look at it in its most puritanical reconstruction and reinterpretation, the kinds of extremism that is brought by Wahhabism, Salafi practices of Islam, which is indeed the disease of the day, we are indeed not looking at this, or shouldn't be looking at this, as a norm within the Islamic world, nor should we look at this as an exception of Islamic behavior. Professor Friedberg, who will talk later, has written extensively about the power of images and breaking images, restoring images, and so forth. I just wanted to bring up, these are views that we saw earlier of the Temple of Bel in Palmyra, but I wanted to also bring this 16th century print, this engraving, that in fact recalls or restores and represents something about the Reformation period in Europe, the religious wars of Europe that caused tremendous destruction of sacred images, of images at large that represented a different point of view. And this too, while we look at it from the angle of a religious conflict, it is absolutely useful to also look at it from the point of view of the politics of the time, which had really broken up Europe with the same kind of brutality and ignorance that, for instance, the Director General of UNESCO had said about the destructions of the Syrian monuments, this kind of ignorance and disregard of Syrian culture. The photographs and images that we see in the current situation have an uncanny relationship or perhaps reverberation in the Daesh actions of today. I just wanted to point out this is the destruction of the statue of Bel in presumably Temple of Bel. It comes from the book of Daniel and has to do with indeed a controversy over the legitimacy of the gods that they worshipped, and Cyrus the Great as part of this dialogue, in fact. It's a very complex, in other words, cross-culturally generated, energized kinds of events. And I also wanted to finish by saying something about these 16th century religious wars, which left, for instance, the churches in the Netherlands, in France, bereft of their sculpture, completely damaged. And indeed, as you can see in this remains of the Reformation iconoclasm, remind us of the kinds of chipping away that we have seen in pictures earlier today. And these, be it recurring historical impulse to break and destroy images for religious or political reasons, bear fruit if we were to look at them a little bit more in light of the historical sort of trajectory, if I may put it that way. Thank you.